In the interest service, Power 88 presents live talk shows to inform, enlighten, and to stimulate thought and dialogue. The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of the staff and management of KCP or the EOB. Now sit back, relax, enjoy the program, and be sure to listen to Power 88 anytime from anywhere by downloading the KCP app.
Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon to any of you who are listening to this. Even if you're listening on YouTube, I'm Mujahid Ramadan, the host and moderator of Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue. And thank you for joining us for our monthly one-hour discussion on issues around interfaith issues and intercultural issues. Today, we're going to be speaking more along. We often talk in terms of interfaith as sharing our views and our perspectives without trying to convince one another, but just getting to know one another. And one of our panelists for today, that's one of her favorite quotes, is people getting to know one another, and we're going to go to that for a moment. So we're going to be talking intercultural today, and it is more along the lines of hate crimes and what is going on here in the U.S. that we see has been on a recent rise, and it's affecting all communities and all of us. So we thought an interfaith intercultural dialogue, that our discussion that also ends with how do we heal ourselves, as we want to be able to talk about, would be excellent for this discussion. Also, would like to always thank our sponsors, Silver Sage Foundation, and their collaborative partners, along with KCEP, for this endeavor and this participation in this event. Our guests for the day come from a wide range of backgrounds and experiences. I'm going to start first with, actually, we're a part of a council here together in Southern Nevada called the Multicultural Advisory Council. That's Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Advisory Council. And she is the Jolie Brislin. And Jolie has been with the ADL since 2008 and serves as a regional director for the Anti-Defamation League of this region, Nevada region, which is headquartered in Las Vegas. She works closely with the staff and lay leaders to implement various programs that focus on anti-Semitism and an array of civil rights issues. One most important being ADL's anti-bias program in Nevada schools. She also collaborates with law enforcement, public safety, elected officials, community members to build bridges of communication and focus on understanding. ADL's law enforcement, education, and interfaith programs are her top priority. Her quote, which I really think is excellent, Jolie, and I may hope to use it, and I'll refer it to yourself, is that you're less likely to hate someone when you know their story. In 2019, the legislative session here in Nevada, Jolie also convened the first biennial of National of Immigrants Seder in Carson City, our state capital, for Nevada legislature, encouraging greater understanding and togetherness among lawmakers. As I mentioned, she's also a part of Metro's Multicultural Advisory Council, along with myself and U.S. Attorney Chu, who I'll be introducing in greater detail. Jolie is originally from Southern California. We have a lot of Southern Californians in Southern Nevada now. They say over probably about 1,200,000. I'm sure California's population is going down. Having moved into Las Vegas in '92, she considered herself a local. She received a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from University of Nevada, Reno, and she enjoys traveling, community service, and spending time with her husband, and being a soccer mom to her 2 children. Jolie Brislin. Jolie, welcome to Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue, and thank you for being a participant. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was an incredible intro. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we also have, as we mentioned, U.S. Attorney, let me go here. Sister Hafza Girdap. She's a member of the HISMET organization. And Sister Hafza, assalamu alaikum to you and Ramadan Mubarak.
Alaikum assalam, and thank you. Ramadan Mubarak to you too.
And to all those who are listening in who are fasting, we are this is halfway point for the month of fasting, the month of Ramadan. This, I believe, in some regards, the 14th day. So we're halfway into the stretch, and I understand that you may just take a break to break the fast because you're on New York time. We're West Coast time. We won't break the fast until later. Hafza Girdap does her PhD in Women's and Gender Studies at Stony Brook University, New York. And her research area is human and women's rights in Muslim contexts. integration and adaptation of Muslim immigrant women, along with the issues of redefinition of their cultural identities. She's also a founding member of the Set Them Free platform, who works for women's rights violated, particularly in Turkey. She's a volunteer in different human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. She was also she spoke at the World Affairs Council Peace Conference about ongoing human rights in Turkey, mostly focusing on women's experiences and enforced migration. Her, as having a personal motto of her life, which is let your dreams lead you, and I think that's very valuable. She has a dream of running towards her goals wherever and whenever possible. Hafza, and as I will call her, our sister, with her two daughters, 17 and 12, and her husband is living in Long Island, New York. And lastly, I won't say the federal government, but it is a part of the federal government. We have the acting U.S. Attorney to Nevada, Christopher Chu. And Mr. Chu is acting U.S. Attorney to Southern Nevada. Prior to March 2021, Chris had served as the district assistant to U.S. Attorney and deputy U.S. Attorney. As an acting U.S. Attorney, Mr. Chu serves as the District of Nevada's chief federal law enforcement officer, overseeing all criminal and civil cases brought on behalf of the United States in the district. He supervises over 100 staff professionals and assistant U.S. attorneys prosecuting cases involving white-collar crime, violent and organized crime, cybercrime, terrorism, narcotics trafficking, public corruption, and civil rights violations, and handling a wide range of affirmative and defense civil litigations, including asset forfeiture, etc. Mr. Chu received his undergraduate degree from Williams College and a bachelor's in economics in psychology, and his JD is from Harvard School of Law. As Chris, it seems as though a substantial amount of people I see in DOJ or read about in DOJ, their reports are from Harvard School of Law. So it seems like it's producing a wide range of people there for the DOJ. Welcome, Chris, and thank you for being a part of our discussion tonight. Thank you for being a part of it.
Mr. Ramadan, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us to be on. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks very much.
And Chris, I introduced you last, but I want to come back to you first.
Sure.
We are seeing a hate crime spike, and I know that is something that DOJ somewhat keeps your finger on the pulse of. And I was just sharing with Jolie that I heard on the news and read online about recent events in New York. I don't think it's necessarily Long Island Hafza, but you may have heard about it, that there were attacks upon 4 to 6 synagogues. They have a suspect in mind, haven't released any other information. Is that something that DOJ goes into along with the FBI?
That's correct, Mr. Ramadan. If we're referring to the same incident, I think 4 New York City synagogues have been targeted, I believe it was yesterday, by a rock-throwing assailant. And we're very grateful, of course, to the quick and hard work of the New York City Police Department. In general, the FBI does take the lead is the lead investigatory agency for all federal hate crime investigations. Our FBI works with state, local, tribal, and other federal law enforcement agencies to investigate hate crimes, and hate crime investigations are one of the top priorities of the FBI Civil Rights Program.
And so the FBI does the investigation, and then your division in terms of DOJ, you do the prosecution.
That's correct, Mr. Ramadan. Our prosecutors, which we call AUSAs, it stands for Assistant United States Attorneys, work hand in glove with our FBI and other federal, local, state, and tribal law enforcement partners.
So is DOJ seeing a rise in hate crimes across the country continually? And how long has this uptick been going on based on your observations?
I mean, hate crimes, Mr. Ramadan, have been going on throughout the years, and there has been, as you noted, a recent rise in hate crimes and hate incidents. You might have seen media reports. There's a recent disturbing trend, of course, in reports of violence against members of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what DOJ has realized is that this requires the department's renewed energy and emphasis on investigation and prosecution. I'll give you one example, Mr. Ramadan. The DOJ, at the end of March, launched an expedited 30-day review to determine how the DOJ can deploy all the tools at its disposal to better combat hate crimes. A couple of examples are how to increase and help track the reporting of hate crimes and hate incidents that may violate federal law, and how we can prioritize criminal investigations and prosecution so that we hold offenders accountable.
Good. Well, at least we know have an understanding of the process. Jolie, from the perspective of ADL and looking at your background and have known you, and thank you so very much for being on the show, but even more so, thank you for the work of ADL in terms of identifying and then educating and providing tools of resolve and resolution. What has been your observation and ADL's in terms of information gathering that reflects the trend towards hate crimes? Who are the perpetrators and who are the victims?
Well, thank you. I mean, this is definitely, an area that ADL is an expert in, and we've really been, looking at the broad scope of this. So yes, we have seen an increase of hate crimes happening throughout the country, specifically around, obviously, gender, race, religion, and we've been working on the ground on that. But I also think we need to start identifying the hate crimes that we're seeing online. And ADL has a Center on Technology and Society where we're really focusing that information of online hate as well and being able to target and report when this online hate is taking place.
That's interesting. So we're now seeing it's not always direct, it's indirect in those regards. Who tends to be the biggest target of victims of hate crimes, and as the numbers have risen as a reason? Well, let me go to this. Let me do even better. Sister Hafza, being a practicing Muslim, you live in Long Island, New York. You're part of an interesting organization of human services. Have you heard of reports of there being an uptick in hate crimes against Muslims? It seems like it's kind of came down on the radar screen, not as high as it has been in recent years. What has been your observation?
Well, my organization is mainly focused on the issues in Turkey, but as a person living in New York, it's a diverse community here. But during the Black Lives Matter, not just specifically Muslim people, but, as a general framework, Black people, including Muslims, Jewish, or other, religion or gender individuals, I unfortunately witnessed a really staggering hate crime against those who are different than the haters. So, as a Muslim person having two daughters, having two teenagers, as an immigrant here, we felt the fear, of course, because we are sending our kids to some schools where the students and the faculty are predominantly white, and they don't feel, belonging because of their colors, because of their appearances. Yeah, but we have also really great, supporters from different communities, including Jewish community, including the Christian community, because I am with my family, we are members of Interfaith Coalition here in New York. So feeling them just beside you, it's supporting, and it's giving the security feeling when you are different.
Mm-hmm. And now, the hate crimes that we speak of in your country, Turkey, they happen along different lines, as though it seems. It doesn't necessarily seem around race or ethnicity, but it seems to be more along the lines of directly, because the people seem to be from the same ethnic background. It seems to be more politics and or religious faith or belief or not. Is that the case?
Yeah. So, as an activist working in human rights, especially women's rights organizations and platforms, I am working and studying the issues related to women. And I know that, all around the world, women's issues and women's rights have always been controversial in terms of their dynamics, in specific context, as well as in the universal arena. as you just mentioned, the political actors claim sovereign power and legitimacy for this power through many different discourses, while making even claims for human and women's rights. And state policies, political agendas in Turkey specifically tend to control women and issues related to women. And what is worse in Turkey, there is a matter of great impunity when it comes to state-led violence and sexual harassment. I have to state that, unfortunately, women's rights have never been truly enjoyed in Turkey. Women have always been subjugated, discriminated, and oppressed by the social, institutional, and structural actors. The laws, and unfortunately, are not properly implemented to protect women or to recognize their rights. And the most influential discourse in Turkey, which plays a huge role in defining women's status and the women's rights, is religion. And the political actors now who have the power in Turkey right now are using the religious discourse very effectively. And, there was a coup attempt in 2016, and Turkey is already deteriorating. Democratic instruments have started to fall apart because of the government's collective persecution of all political dissidents and critics. And the regime needed... Yeah.
Yeah, so you're certainly making it clear to us that along the cultural lines, it's the same behavior, but there's a different stimuli and there's a different context. And I do want to go back to that. But I wanted to come to the U.S. Attorney, Chris, and speak to you in terms of question that my recent reviewing information is that hate crimes in Las Vegas, 49 reported, 34 based on race. Of those, 21 were African Americans. So African Americans, at least here in Southern Nevada, and probably across the country, are a significant part of those rising numbers. What is DOJ seeing in that regard?
That's a very good point,
in terms of who are the victims.
You make a very good point about the victims, Mr. Ramadan, which is, although the media has been reporting more on violence against members of the AAPI community in conjunction with the start of the pandemic, it's important to keep in mind that most victims of reported hate crimes are African Americans. From the perspective of the DOJ, victims come across a wide spectrum. We have African Americans who, as I just said, are the victims in most hate crimes. We've seen how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, there's been a disturbing trend in an uptick in violence against them since the start of the pandemic. But it could take place against any type of victim. For example, I understand that 2 Hawaiian men were indicted for an assault on a Caucasian who moved into their neighborhood. So, to your question about victims, for last year, I believe and by the way, the highest, the most prevalent group of victims of anti-religious hate crimes. 2 years ago, about 60% of those victims were motivated by the offender's anti-Jewish bias. About 13% were victims of anti-Islamic bias. And so it can span the whole gamut.
So America's diversity leads to even a wider range of discriminations and hate crimes, as though it's seen as Hafsa was speaking of in Turkey. There are certain specifics that are there. Some of them are gender-related. Some of them are religious-related. But in America, we have race and or ethnicity. We have religion. Jolie, what from ADL study and research and long-term observation, what tends to be the driving, motivating force of people when it comes to hate crimes against other populations? What tends to be the driving force behind that? What's their motivation? What's the reason?
Well, I mean, at ADL, we believe that hate is learned and with education can be unlearned, which is really, why we work so hard to build bridges and have dialogue and understanding, because once you know somebody's story, you can't hate them. But, we often are put through the media, through conversations. There's always a group that seems to be made to be the other. And that is what is one of the most divisive things that we as a society do, is that we need to be understanding our differences, celebrating our differences, but not making people into be the other, because the narrative that goes with that is hate speech, hate crimes, and worse. So, yeah.
What are some of the tools that ADL suggests and or offer to help address this type of, when you say getting to know one another, drill down deeper for that course? What are some of the things and activities that you would recommend?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have a couple different scopes that we need to be doing all at the same time, right? We have on a federal scope, we need to be looking at legislation. We need to be talking about how do we do a better job at reporting. And I know that you gave the numbers of 44 in the state of Nevada. Well, I have to say, I believe that that's probably underreported, and that we have to do a better job in our state to be educating law enforcement and to be holding people accountable to be investigating crimes as hate crimes when they fit that criteria. And so we need to be looking at this legislation. We need to be working with our elected officials. We also need to be looking at what we can do. We have our Center of Technology and Society. How do we identify online hate? How do we address that? How do we hold online companies accountable for terms of service, right? Because that information continues to be brought into society and this conversation continues to be enacted. We have our education, right? Because again, we know that hate is learned, and with education can be unlearned. And if we're working with our students, if we're working with our parents, if we're working with our teachers, and we're able to start changing the dialogue or giving people tools on how to address bias when they see it, that ultimately will go to lowering those hate crimes as well. And then, of course, Mujahid, like one of the things that you and I do so often together is that we sit at a table before COVID, and we break bread, and we have these conversations, and we understand and celebrate the differences and how we're able to come together as one community to stand in solidarity with one another and to educate others on how our differences make us stronger.
Yes. Why would you emphasize starting with the young people? Is there a particular benefit we gain if we start working with the younger populations on understanding each other's differences, and that the differences really are the things that bring us together as one?
Yeah, I truly believe that if we empower people to speak up when they see bias or hatred, if they can understand what to look for, right? If we're also teaching our children about celebrating, I go back to this word a lot because I do think that's what we have to do. It's not about a melting pot, right, and having everybody be the same. It's about taking our differences and celebrating our diversity, and to understand that and have our children understand that and be able to have conversations around that. And then be able to speak up if they do see hate or bias or bigotry. And so if we can start to teach our youth and empower them, they're going to be the greatest advocates we've ever seen.
Then hopefully the future generations will be better than we have been in this regard. Hafza, in Turkey, what you're dealing with there seems to have a different context in the sense of there's more of a government, I don't know if I would use the term participation, and or at least giving legitimacy to the exploitations of certain people. Here in the U.S., at least we have a government, as you can see, listening to the U.S. attorney, that really not only blocks it, but investigates it and prosecutes it. Many Americans wouldn't know what it was like to have a government that participates actually in the exploitation of its own population. Myself as African American, I know the U.S. actually did it because we had legislation not only in slavery, but even in the Jim Crow era and up through 1968 that was the government-sponsored discrimination and prejudice and denial of social justice and civil rights of African Americans. How damaging is that to the spirit and the morale of people when the government actually propagates against them and fights against and condemns them? How challenging is that?
Yeah, it's very important what you just touched on, Mr. Ramadan. And in this sense, when we go back to Turkey, there the regime, which means that the state power needed an enemy to cover their corruption up or their, undemocratic deeds. And the most convenient people or groups seem to be particularly journalists who publicly criticize human rights defenders or Hizmet movement followers or HDP party. It's a party whose members are mostly Kurdish and LGBTQ individuals and so on. And in this regard, more than 130,000 people following the coup attempt were dismissed from their jobs. This is such a discrimination, a huge discrimination, a huge purge. And the government's harsh persecution has reached the lives of thousands of women, along with their infants and children. This is a huge, huge persecution, including even the kids. And this current administration, the current regime, uses arbitrary arrests and lengthy pretrial detentions to imprison these human rights defenders or dissidents, including women. I have to declare that these cases, with numbers, but facts are facts, and they are important. And as of now, the number of women arbitrarily incarcerated as political prisoners is more than 5,000, with a devastating increase. And among these persecuted are more than 700 mothers, imprisoned with their babies.
So it seems
such a hate discourse created by the government against dissidents, gender-based or ethnic-based. The idea in the society is also important, influenced by the state. Discrimination and violence against women, including femicide cases, have risen drastically. In 2020 alone, 300 women were killed, and the perpetrators have been released. So, and alone in the month of March, 28 women were killed. And the Turkish government has just withdrawn from the Istanbul Convention, an international convention, basically focuses on gender-based violence. And it means that the laws are not anymore protecting and recognizing the women's rights, especially the dissidents.
Well, I certainly hope that Americans and or even those who have migrated here listening to what you're saying can really value and benefit from the fact of democracy that this nation provides. With all of its flaws, there are certain things that are not tolerated, and we've grown and we've evolved, and there are many, many more people. America itself is probably the most diverse nation in the world. Jolie, I often say it's triple in the sense that we start our worship services on Friday with Muslims, Saturday with the Jewish population, Sunday with the Christians. And then throughout the week, we have all the other faith traditions that are involved or engaged. And certainly we think through interfaith, we can spread the word more into the public. But Mr. U.S. Attorney, Chris, the gay, lesbian, transgender community, who are also part of the Multicultural Advisory Council, they've been noting an uptick in hate crimes and violence against gay, lesbian populations, with transgender being the biggest target. And of those in transgender, the African-American transgender seems to be the largest target. Is DOJ seeing that uptick also?
That's correct, Mr. Ramadan. And I'm glad you raised that point about the LGBTQ community. The DOJ is focused on stopping hate crimes against all categories of potential victims. I want to go back to something that Ms. Brislin brought up, which is the idea that in 2019 there were 44 total hate crimes reported in Nevada, and I believe the word used was underreported. My instinct is likewise that figure is an underreporting, and I'd like to make a plea, Mr. Ramadan, a request for the community, which is the DOJ understands that there's certainly a variety of reasons why victims might not choose to report certain hate-based crimes. For example, you could be afraid of retaliation. You could be embarrassed that you were victimized. You might distrust law enforcement. And you could fear being exposed as a member of the LGBTQ community, or you could be concerned about immigration issues popping up. The request that we would make to the community is, please report hate crimes to the FBI. The FBI, we want to know what incidents are going on so we can better deploy our tools and our resources to stop it. So thank you for the opportunity to make that plea to our communities.
So I definitely want to go back to, so by not reporting it, then it doesn't allow for those who are in the area of public safety and law enforcement to then take the resources and invest into investigating those type of incidents.
That's absolutely right, Mr. Ramadan. And I'll point out that we are fortunate in Las Vegas to be able to work with a very proactive local law enforcement partner. That's Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Mr. Ramadan, I think when we were talking a couple of weeks ago, I point out how grateful our office was that shortly after the tragedy in Atlanta, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, on its own initiative, trying to be proactive, deployed extra patrols to the Chinatown area and went around speaking to members of the community and local businesses. And I think our relationships and the hard work of our local, state, and federal law enforcement partners here are what has kept the hate crime numbers lower than they otherwise would be without such proactive law enforcement partners.
Okay. And Chris,
can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I couldn't agree with you more. And one of the things that I think Metro LVMPD does really well is their community policing and how they are part of communities. They're not being reactive, they're proactive. And I think that also helps. It goes right into what you were saying about having lower hate crime numbers, because I think that they really do. They're on the ground having these conversations.
Well, I think that certainly the three of us can attest to the fact of the evolution that we've seen in the receptiveness of listening to community members and the benefit of having that diversity and conversation that allows for them to make decisions and strategic planning. Hafza, you could be brief on this one. If a person is a victim of a hate crime in Turkey, who do you report it to?
Actually, as an organization, with my organization, we are writing reports on specific cases. For example, women's rights violations or minority rights violations or property seizures, such this, and we are submitting them to the related committees in the United Nations, in the European Court of Human Rights. We are working with mostly the global international human rights community.
So you don't have the access of being able to report it to your local police department or your district attorneys or people who function at those levels because they're government appointed. You don't have that luxury that we, as citizens of this country, we do have that luxury. That doesn't seem to be the case there in Turkey.
No, but the dissidents who are living abroad, who fled Turkey, for example, in Europe, in the United States, we are facing hate crimes by the Turkish government supporters here. And we face some kind of, protests or some people are visiting our houses, in quotes, houses to, disturb us. And we are, of course, reporting these cases to the local law enforcement.
Okay. Well, I guess it affirms the fact I heard a statement some years ago says the happiest and the freest Muslims in the world live in the United States of America. And, of course, having lived here all my life, both as a non-Muslim and Muslim, I can certainly attest to that fact. Chris, I wanted to go back again to the Asian population, the uptick. There has been discrimination against that population of those who we consider to be Asian. I want to go a little deeper into that. But historically, the United States, with the Exclusion Act back in the 1860s, has had a tendency similar to that of the African-American community that goes back to 1619, of discriminating against those of Asian descent, primarily initially in the 1800s. It was the Chinese population, but it's gradually evolved forward. So this uptick with the COVID, do you think the COVID was the main driving force behind that, or was the potential already always there below the surface?
I think the answer is probably both, Mr. Ramadan, that there's certainly a correlation between the uptick in these reports of violence against Asian American and Pacific Islander victims. And that, as you've mentioned, this is not the first time, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act didn't just come up 5 or 10 years ago. And I'll point out that's part of the reason why we are proud to serve in the Department of Justice, which has as one of its core principles advancing equal justice under law. We're very proud, and not a lot of people know, that the DOJ was established during Reconstruction in the aftermath of the Civil War, where our first mission was to secure the civil rights promised by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so when we were brand new, the Department of Justice was prosecuting hundreds of cases against KKK members who engaged in racially motivated violence. So now, 150 years later, we still have hate crimes in our country, and the DOJ will still be doing its best to combat it across the country.
Well, that is encouraging to hear. And understanding to our listening audience, understanding the history of discrimination of certain populations in the area that we live in. But this is not a issue that we're, for instance, African Americans are being discriminated against primarily through racism in this country, and has been going on. But there was a time that the Jewish population and still is discriminated against through anti-Semitism. But this goes back to the history of this country. But there was a time the Irish and the Scandinavian were also considered non-white. And so to Chris, I think, and to Jolie and Hafza, you can chime in on this one. Who seems to be the larger populations of perpetrators when it comes to hate crime? And I'm not trying to finger point anyone, but where does the larger population of perpetrators seem to originate from?
This is Chris, and I can take a crack at that first, Mr. Ramadan, if it's okay with you, Ms. Brislin, which is we see perpetrators of all kinds, and most importantly, the DOJ doesn't look at specific groups of perpetrators. What we do is we follow the violence, whoever it might be, whether it's, for example, the Boogaloos, which generally are not racially motivated, whether it's someone like a defendant our district prosecuted a couple of years ago who was radicalized online and was planning to bomb a local synagogue as well as attack a local Vegas bar that he believed catered to the LGBTQ community. So, Mr. Ramadan, from the Department of Justice perspective, we don't look at the specific groups, we follow the violence.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
And that's exactly the ADL as well. And the incident that you were just speaking about with Connor Climo in Las Vegas and the target of a perceived synagogue and LGBT bar was also on that list was the local ADL, my office specifically as a target. And so we completely agree with following the violence and following the hate speech.
Mm-hmm. Does hate crime, does population increase of certain populations, does that seem to have any significance when it comes to hate crimes?
This is Chris, Mr. Ramadan. I'd like to go back to something Ms. Brislin pointed out, which is addressing online hate. And something that the FBI director mentioned a little more than a week ago, or about a week ago, is that the most significant threat to the United States is now posed by lone actors who often radicalize online. And then they seek out soft targets like houses of worship, retail locations, mass public gatherings to attack with easily accessible weapons. And so, to Ms. Brislin's point, radicalization online hate is a key emphasis if we're to try to combat hate crimes and domestic terrorism generally.
So similar to the radicalization of those who were considered members of ISIS and terrorist organizations that were seemingly referenced back to and many times to Muslims, which clearly it was, the radicalization almost occurs in many regards in the same process.
That's right. It doesn't have to be religiously motivated violent extremists. It could be ethnically or racially motivated extremists who are also radicalized online.
It seems as though the personalities and the characteristics of many of those who are radicalized and then who are driven towards perpetrating hate crimes seems to be the characteristics, whether they are Muslim or so-called Muslims, because Muhammad Julan, the spiritual leader of Hizmet, says that a Muslim can't be a terrorist and a terrorist can't be a Muslim. But the so-called Muslims and the so-called Christians who also commit hate crimes here in the United States in terms of domestic terrorism seem to have the same characteristic and makeups of loners, rejectors of society, not well received, not thinking well of themselves, disenchanted with the way things are, and having difficulties with change that by people who are different than them. Those the same characteristics seems to be in both populations.
Can I just chime in this point with Mr. Ramadan? Along with radicalization, I think polarization also plays a huge role. If people who are discriminated or who are subject to violence, if Muslim people, Jewish people, LGBTQ people, if they somehow come together in solidarity, in political unity, I believe that if the polarization goes away, some radicalized people within these communities cannot find any opportunities or any environments to proceed and operate within their hate beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and to go off of the polarization, you also have the normalization, which increases this arena, right? And when this hate and violence becomes normal, people are not recognizing and identifying it, and it's not stopping people to have those kind of conversations and say that this is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
But Jolie, and to take that a bit further, the behavior of sometimes young people, let's take for instance the young man who shot up the church in South Carolina, killed several, I think 9 parishioners, and was later arrested, seemed to have been radicalized online. Is it transgenerational? There was a study by Rachel Yehuda, a Jewish psychologist, on Holocaust survivors and the transgenerational impact of the trauma of the Holocaust that was showed up some 12, 15, 20 years later in the descendants of those Holocaust survivors, but the children and the grandchildren didn't experience the Holocaust. Could the bias, bigotry, racism, and prejudice that we see in many be inherited from the previous generation? And sometimes they say it goes back multitudes of generations. Does that happen in terms of the ones who perpetrate the crime? And Jolie, that was directed at you, because we know the victims pass on their traumatization.
Mm-hmm.
Does the perpetrator also pass on their traumatization to their children?
Absolutely. So I always try to think about it like a kitchen table, right? When you're eating dinner with your family tonight, think about the conversations you're having with your children, right? And what does that look like? What does that sound like? And if you're watching the news, what kind of conversations are you hearing there that you're bringing to the table? So again, hate is learned, and with education can be unlearned, and with dialogue can be unlearned. But one of the interesting, ADL recently put out a study. It's actually called a table talk. And if you go to adl.org, you can find these ways to have these conversations around the kitchen table with your kids. And if you're a teacher, there are lesson plans on how to have conversations in your classroom. But there was recently a table talk that was put out called Propaganda, Extremism, and Online Recruitment Tactics, right? And and I think that this is something that hopefully your listeners, because we don't have enough time to go into the meat and potatoes of all of this, but if they go to adl.org and look at this report, they can bring these best practices and tools to their own home.
Good. Chris, how difficult it is in prosecuting hate crimes now? Because many times, many states are hesitant in terms of identifying an act as a hate crime, and I know ADL has been instrumental in increasing that with our legislature here. But how difficult it is on the DOJ federal side to prosecute the hate crime?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Mr. Ramadan. There's one key hurdle, one key additional issue that we have to clarify in terms of federal hate crimes, which is when there's a hate crime incident, law enforcement needs to investigate not just the incident, but prove the state of mind of the defendant. Putting another way, we have to investigate the defendant's background to show that the incident was hate motivated. That's what makes it a federal hate crime. And so it's an extra step, it's an extra challenge. It is not always the easiest thing to do. We can think of a classic hate crime situation where a person of one race approaches someone of a different race screaming racial epithets and engages in a violent attack. If we see that, kind of say, okay, that seems like a classic hate crime situation. Then what if it's the assailant who's completely silent as she or he approaches a victim of a different race, commits a violent assault, and runs off? In that case, for example, our office, working with our law enforcement partners, especially the FBI, will be looking at the suspect's social media posts, for example, to see what racially, to see how we can prove that the act of physical harm was motivated by some sort of racial, religious, or gender animus. So glad you asked that, Mr. Ramadan. And there is that extra step with a federal hate crime. We have to look into the defendant's mind a little bit.
Well, Chris, thank you for that. Go ahead, Jolie.
I was going to say, one of the ways that ADL works closely with law enforcement is ADL Center on Extremism, which is based out of New York, where they monitor and track online hate and extremism, and then they share that information with law enforcement.
Well, that's a good tool. Collaboration does benefit across the board. Chris, I want to go back to the Asian pop. We say Asian, and we teach this in the academy. But within what we call the Asian population here in the United States, there are how many different ethnic or cultural groups that are uniquely different by their own right, but we just say all Asian. Is there what's that number look like?
Off the top of my head, I don't know here in Las Vegas. I can say growing up in Los Angeles, I'm going to give you the legal term of a ton.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are we still there?
Yes, Mr. Ramadan. I'm unable to give you a specific number on the different groups that comprise the AAPI community here in Las Vegas. I think we can leave it as a lot. Off the top of my head, we have a vibrant Filipino community here in Las Vegas, a very active Filipino community, a significant Chinese population, a Taiwanese population, Japanese folks, and so on and so forth. We can actually make a fairly extensive list.
Mm-hmm. And I think the last count we used in a class was it's like 13 to possibly 15. So we'll say Asian, and many times, many Americans really won't know the difference. There was a Sikh gentleman killed in Arizona because he wears a turban, and the person who, the perpetrator said, he was trying to kill Muslims in this country and trying to protect this country from the Muslims. And he didn't have he wasn't informed enough to even know that there's a difference between Muslims and Sikhs. So many times people aren't able to, say you can't judge the book by looking at the cover. And I'm certainly, I've seen this in the what we call Asian population, where you have so many vast different cultures or ethnic populations who like to be identified like that, but we will just say Asian. Sister Hafsa, as we were heading towards conclusion at this point in time, I wanted to talk about, to go and borrow from Hizmet and its philosophical philosophy and philosophical leader. There's a quote by, I believe, of Muhammad Julan. It says that we are all limbs of the same body. We should cease this duality that violates our union. Where have we as a nation failed at that, and where has the world failed at that from the perspective of Julan? That we are part of one body, and this duality that we're functioning in, it really damages our very union. Have we failed in that, and what do we need to do differently to resolve that?
Yeah, that's a beautiful, quotation. I mean, insight from Julan. And, on top of what you said, I want to emphasize that we have to speak up, and we have to do it in solidarity, as you said, in a union, in a unity. And in this regard, there are, these solidarity and support are the keywords that I have learned from Gulen, I have learned in my activism and community work. So it's not a fight to win alone. I'm talking about, fight against injustice, fight against, hate and hatred. So it's not a fight to win alone, but by increasing the coming together. At this point, diversity is beautiful. And in the context of Turkey, besides the gender-based violence, ethnic and religious hate crime is also very prevalent against Kurdish people, against Armenian people, and more. So I and my organization strongly believe that as Kurdish, as secular or pious, as Alawis, as Armenians, as left-wing or right-wing, all together, we have to speak up, we have to stand up, and we can extend the idea of solidarity and unity beyond Turkey case, I believe. So we could and should urge our community leaders, religious leaders, directors in businesses, politicians in office to ensure that human rights, women's rights are respected and preserved. They are not discriminated. And we should also make sure that the perpetrators of violence are brought into justice no matter what it takes. So in this case, I again want to emphasize that women who are exposed to violence, physically, sexually, financially, should be encouraged to speak out. I think Julie just, highlighted that. And we can just, and must do this by breaking prejudices or, discrimination against each other. We have to, fight against also polarization, which divides us and which eventually creates so many different camps, and this ultimately makes us weak. We have to do it, in unity and solidarity.
Well, thank you for that insight. And I know I'll quote by Bedul Zaman Said Nursi. He says, "To forgive the cobra for biting is an insult to all of those who the cobra has bitten." So there is a place for forgiveness and reconciliation. Jolie, we're 21st century now. America is the most diverse country in the world. Southern Nevada, Clark County, based on the last Pew report that I received, indicated that Southern Nevada is one of the most diverse metropolitan, 2.5 million plus population in the country. Chris talked about the wide range of Asian populations, the Pacific Islanders, the Hispanic Latino population from various countries of Central and South America, and of course the growing the African American population, the Jewish population. Have we failed in this, Jolie? And what does ADL offer and say going forward to the future to bring about that reconciliation?
So have we failed in this? It's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about, where are we today? Where were we? I was thinking about, I was watching something from 1992, which doesn't really seem that long ago, right? But that was 3 decades ago. And hearing the language and hearing the conversation that was taking place, I pictured if that was today in 2021, and if this was my kids talking, and I can't fathom this kind of language coming out of my kid's mouth, right? It was almost accepted language. And I think that we're not there yet, but we're making progress. I think we're better than we were. I think that our kids are going to be better than we are today. And as long as we have organizations like the ADL, the NAACP, the Color of Change, Urban League, like the MMAC committee, and we have partnerships with law enforcement, we're holding that dam up, and we're making sure we're holding people accountable to make sure that we're protecting the solidarity of humanity of where we are. And so I do have a lot of faith. I think that it's not great. We're not perfect, but hopefully together we'll continue to progress this conversation.
Well, the Constitution said in order to make this a more perfect union. So we're saying it's not perfect, but we do have the opportunity for that experience of perfecting it. Jolie, you made a mention young people. Chris, you heard that comment. I saw young people out there. Hafza, I'm sure you see it. I saw young people marching in social activists and social justice movements and Black Lives Matter movements, and young Caucasian white children carrying signs that said, "White people, your silence is getting my black brothers and sisters killed." And this is a Generation Z. This is a very young generation. I'm talking about children that range from 15 years old to 18 to 25 years old. Does that tell us that the younger generation of Americans beyond baby boomers, certainly my generation, Generation X, which represents many of you, Generation Y, Generation Z, Millennium, are they seeing through a different lens than the previous generations that caused them to ask for social justice for everyone? And the death of George Floyd is the death of all of us. Are they seeing it that way based on the protests that we're seeing?
I would say that the younger generation appears to be reflecting some change over time, that the younger generation, as the country progresses, is becoming more aware about hate crimes and hate incidents. And Mr. Ramadan, if I may, amplify my previous request for the community, which is, as Ms. Brislin mentioned, we have wonderful community leaders here in Las Vegas, like the ADL and the NAACP, and community leaders like yourself, who play an important role in making sure that hate crimes and hate incidents get reported. Mr. Ramadan, the example I toss out for your consideration is, if there is a hate incident against a young Muslim woman here in Las Vegas, she might be reluctant, for good reasons, in good faith, to report this to law enforcement, but she could feel more comfortable reporting it to a religious leader or a community leader, in which case we would ask for your help so that we're aware of what's going on and law enforcement can take steps to address that. And so it's a request not only for the community to please let the FBI know about hate crimes and hate incidents, but for community leaders like yourself to amplify that message and make sure those are properly reported.
And reporting it, of course, to enforcement agencies like the FBI and Metropolitan Police Department and others is a good avenue. And, of course, all of us working together, it makes the lifting a lot lighter. Younger generations that we're working with, you say it's important to work with them. You know, I'm seeing them now fighting for social justice, and they're from all different ethnic and quote-unquote racial backgrounds. Are the younger generations looking through a different paradigm, a different lens than the previous generations possibly? Do they understand better getting along with one another?
Well, I sure hope so, because we as humans continue to evolve. But I also think that today, versus maybe when I was younger or my parents, we have more access to information. And so, for instance, ADL has a heat map, which is hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. And you can go to our website and you can get a up-to-the-minute tracking of incidents that are happening around the country. And so I really hope that with this increased technology and increased knowledge, younger people feel so much more emboldened to speak out in a positive sense, because they have all the information at their fingertips.
So your comments are young Muslim populations learning to be more socially engaged and socially involved, who've grown up here in America, more so than their parents who may have migrated to America. Are they more socially engaged and socially involved?
So I'm very hopeful with the younger generation, because I'm mentoring them. Within our organization, we have youth teams who are very engaging with the social justice issues, whatever departments or whatever majors are they doing in their colleges or high schools. I'm mentoring them. We are organizing panels, conferences or art contests, just, related to human rights issues. And I see that they are really aware of what's going on in the United States, in the global context, and they are really willing to participate in, taking action part of the human rights. And in that regard, I agree with Chris, because he brought to the issue that sometimes people are not, willing to report to the law enforcement, but they can do it with religious leaders, community leaders, and also grassroots organizations, just as ours. So they play a huge role.
I appreciate all of you. You've been very engaging. You've been very insightful and very informative. May you all be rewarded, even though it's part of some of our jobs. Again, thank our listening audience and Silver Sage Foundation. And I hope that in future times we're going to have some of you back for further discussion on interfaith, intercultural dialogue. To our listening audience, we appreciate you listening in. And on the 6th, the first Saturday in June, we're going to have a discussion with an all-women's panel. While this was dominated by women here, in terms of participation, it'll be all three women talking on the 21st century being the century of the woman. To our U.S. Attorney General, to the ADL Director, to the HESMAT representative, thank you all very much for sharing in this discussion. It will be listened to broadly, and we'll send you information on the follow-up to our listening audience. Thank you. Peace be unto all of you. Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak to those who are fasting. Thank you for sharing and listening, and thank you to our panelists for a very excellent discussion. Be well and peace.
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you need information on KCEP special events, programming features, community bulletins, upcoming concert information, employment opportunities, or just want to listen out of town, log on to Power 88L.